close.
Excellent.
Yeah. And we're live. Wow, that was really fast. I hit the button, Ben, and it immediately turned from blue to red. Anyways, and we're live. It is Wednesday, November 17th, 5:01 p.m. Eastern Time. And Ben is the monologue. Ben.
So I want to announce an important fact that I know that a bunch of you have been wondering about, which is the question of whether Daniel Burge actually exists or not. Now, let's review the state of the evidence prior to today. He has been on In Lieu of Fun religiously and asks incredibly good short questions. That tends to favor existence. He appears on the Discord channel. He has had a couple bylines on Washington Post op-eds.
He has a Substack newsletter thing.
Yeah, and all of that tends to favor existence. On the other side of the equation,
is existence a bundle of sticks? I don't understand.
There has been the fact that nobody has seen him outside of his native habitat. There has been no sighting of Daniel Burge outside of his chair. Very few, no sightings unbacklit, and no sightings, and very few outside of his camouflage with his couch. Until today, when the following happened. I want to show you an actual image. There's so much that this
it actually
image proves.
Fuzzy. I just want to say, it's not just fuzzy in this; it's fuzzy in the image that you texted me, which makes me think that it's photoshopped and that this is not a real thing that's happening.
No. I am telling you, I am your affiant in this. I took this picture. It proves not merely that Daniel Burge actually exists, but that he has legs, which was not previously known. It also proves that, in fact, his torso is not his couch. Because I know sometimes in the when he appears on In Lieu of Fun, the head just seems to rise out of the couch. That is, in fact, not the case. So we have... Oh, one other thing that it proves, he drinks iced coffee. The following I can now confirm with personal experience. And I just want to say it was a pleasure to actually meet Daniel in person. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to meet Daniel Burge in person. And
to have Aaron Perzanowski on the show to talk about his new book.
That's right, and he must think we're super weird now.
We warned him of this in the back, beforehand. So, Aaron, it's so nice to have you on the show. Thanks for coming.
Welcome.
Yeah, it is wonderful to be here. The automatic timer on my lights in my office just went out, so
go wave your arms. It happens to people. It's happened before on the show to people. You're not even the first one.
So the sensor is blocked by a sort of built-in wardrobe, and so I'm gonna have to sneak off camera for just a second to get the lights back. But give me a second.
No, do it.
All right, that'll give me a chance to announce that whoever is responsible for sending me this mysterious dog shirt that just showed up, please identify yourself, because there's no card.
I think you were really testing Aaron's ability to keep a straight face, and we're breaking you down, Aaron. Slowly. Yes, someone sent Ben a new dog shirt. So reveal yourself, whoever that was. Okay, on to more serious matters, like how I managed to somehow book the world expert in the right to repair on the same day that Apple announced fortuitously, maybe not so fortuitously given your book.
No, they knew it was They knew he was coming on the show, and they're just like, we're not letting that guy talk about us without an announcement today. And they raced it forward. How'd you get them to do it, Aaron?
Yeah.
I take complete credit for the shift in the policy of the world's, second or third most valuable company. That is the power of academic writing, and everybody who says that legal scholars do.
Cambridge University Press is no slouch, Aaron. Don't knock yourself.
So yeah, it's interesting to sort of see the news develop around this issue as I'm like waiting desperately for this manuscript that's been finished for months and months and months to make its way out into the world. So, you've got this big announcement from Apple today. We've had announcements from Microsoft. We've had executive orders. We've had action from the FTC, some of which I managed to cram into an epilogue. But eventually, they gotta print books, and you gotta stop writing. It's a challenge.
Yeah. So let's back up and kind of talk from the beginning, kind of around the history of the right to repair, and your background, just to introduce you to the audience, is in intellectual property. You're a property professor. You wrote a book with Kate Darling, who's also been on the show. And you wrote a book with Jason Schultz, who is yet to be on the show, but you two should come back on because that is one of my favorite books. And I excerpt it for my property class. It's called The End of Ownership.
Oh,
it's a tremendous, tremendous book that I think speaks to my students. Love it because I think it truly speaks to it is exactly what it sounds like. It's the end of people buying houses, buying couches, buying music, buying everything. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book that Jason Schultz at NYU and Aaron have written. And now you have this solo authored piece on the right to repair. But what is the right to repair? Just for everyone who doesn't know.
Sure. So the basic idea behind the right to repair is that, when people go out and they purchase devices, whether it's, a kitchen appliance or your smartphone or your car or a piece of agricultural equipment, one of the things that we all expect to enjoy with respect to those purchases is the ability to fix it if something goes wrong. And there are a lot of ways in which, device makers have attempted and in many ways succeeded in preventing or discouraging those sorts of repairs. This isn't entirely new. This idea of sort of planned obsolescence has been around, since at the very least kind of the middle of the 20th century. But software introduces a whole bunch of new techniques and strategies that companies can use to make repair really difficult and to kind of tilt the balance towards, replacing consumer goods rather than repairing them. So there's been this kind of legal movement. And not just a legal movement, like a sort of grassroots movement to legislate, to push regulators to try to recognize these sorts of consumer rights.
So you say that there was kind of since the middle of the 20th century. Do you think that there was something to do with the development and the ubiquity of plastics or any type of material of the development or I'm just kind of curious what technologically in the manufacturing process changed such that people thought that goods were fungible enough and cheap enough to make that it made more sense to build in planned obsolescence and less sense to build something that would last. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of pieces to this, right? One part of the story is that this term planned obsolescence grows out of the Great Depression and this idea that we have all of this manufacturing capacity sitting there idle, and the problem is a lack of demand. And so the proposed solution was, well, let's just round up all of the old things that we have, right, and destroy them. And then people will have to buy new things, right? And if you have to buy new things, then we're going to go out and we're going to produce more. And that was
I'm
sort
just
of
imagining FDR coming in, smashing my refrigerator, and being too bad, get a new one.
So this was like the proposal, and it wasn't coming from the administration, but the proposal was to have a sort of government enforcement mechanism where there would be an expiration date on consumer goods, and when that date hit, things would be rounded up and destroyed, and you'd have to go buy new stuff. And the government, of course, like never imposed that rule, but manufacturers, I think, realized that they had a pretty clear business interest in selling more stuff, right? You make more money if you sell 5 toasters than if you sell 1 toaster. And so companies develop strategies that shorten the lifespan of these devices, that encourage people to replace things even if they didn't need to be repaired, right? So General Motors comes up with the brilliant idea of model years for cars. And you make slight aesthetic changes year to year so that after 3 or 4 years, there's social pressure to like replace your car and get a new model, even if it still works perfectly well. And we've seen that sort of strategy, just sort of, grow and develop in a whole bunch of new directions over the past, 20 years or so. I think also, post World War II, right, where there's all of this manufacturing capacity and a sense that, well, how do we keep these factories running? We can build more things than people need, so we have to manufacture demand, in addition to just sort of manufacturing the devices.
Sorry, go ahead, Ben. You're muted though.
So how much of this is accelerated by the tendency in the software industry not to sell you things but to license them, and so like I don't know what part of my iPhone I actually own. I know I don't own the software that's on it. I've clicked through licenses that entitle me to use it under a variety of circumstances that may or may not be true, because I never read the click-through agreements like everybody else. And similarly, there is a fair bit of, even hardware that companies at some point simply stop supporting in the ultimate expression of planned obsolescence. And so I'm curious how much of this is that they actually, you don't own enough of the products that you buy anymore to really repair them even, because they're actually they're in some meaningful legal sense owned by other operators.
So I think that's a really important point. So, there's been historically kind of a line separating products and services. And that line, I think, is increasingly blurry today. A lot of consumers, when you buy your phone, they think of it as a product. It's a product that they own. It's a physical device that goes in their pocket. They carry it around with them. But that product is essentially useless without a whole connected sort of ecosystem of related services, right? You got to have connectivity, right? You've got to have software. You got to have software updates. Without those services, the device can't perform in the way that we expect it to, right? So part of what's happening is a shift in people's kind of relationships with these devices. More and more of the functionality is offloaded to, some server somewhere that I'm in the dark again, that hopefully you can still see me.
Yeah.
Good. So, the functionality gets kind of offloaded to, these cloud servers somewhere. And there are aspects of functionality that are just not physically contained on the device anymore. So the example I use in the book to kind of describe this phenomenon is this social robot Jibo that got put out a few years ago. It's this, little foot tall device, and it will like interact with you and tell you jokes and talk to you. But almost none of the functionality is actually contained within that plastic shell, right? If it doesn't have the ability to connect to the servers that operate all of these neat tricks it can do, the thing is just sort of an inanimate collection of hardware. And so when the company that created it goes out of business, it starts to basically die in front of people's eyes. And there's nothing you can do physically to fix that problem. So I think there is some need for greater transparency here when it comes to distinguishing between the functionality that's built into the device locally and the functionality that is, been sort of outsourced to some server somewhere. And I think we ought to try to think through the idea of, incentives to localize functionality as much as we can from a consumer perspective, right? That makes you less dependent on this sort of tether that's connecting you back to the manufacturer.
Yeah, so I think that this in part gets into kind of a much more academic and philosophical debate about what ownership means, which is something that obviously as property professors, like we both of us talk about in class, and you talk about an end of ownership with Jason. But I kind of want to dig into that for a second, which is kind of like, as Ben points out, like you're licensing the software, you're licensing all of these things. But yes, you own, maybe you feel like you own the physical device. And I'd argue, I think a lot of people would argue, you would argue because it's tangible, because you have control over it, because you can put it in your pocket, because you paid money for it like up front. And even though its value is completely, it is completely valueless or very low value for its actual physical properties, it is its ability to network with other devices and like a greater like set of services that give it its power. And so which part, so like in the hierarchy of those types of levels of ownership, like let's say the metal band around your like iPhone, the glass, like the functionality of the button, like or of like the home screen button on the older models. We'll use the iPhone because you use it and like you talk about it a fair amount. And there's like, but like what in those versus the software versus the intangible does right to repair? Where does right to repair come in? Does it come in for both? And like, where do you see the future of right to repair being? Is it going to stay so firmly in a physical type of right to repair, or do you think it's going to move more in society towards a software element?
Yeah, this is an important question and a hard set of lines to draw. So I think primarily when people think about and talk about the right to repair, they're focused on the physical components of a device, right? You want to swap out the busted screen on your smartphone, or you want to you want to replace some, component of the engine of your car, whatever it is, right? There are physical pieces that we care about having control over. Part of the reason this question that you're asking is so tough is the software is oftentimes inseparable from the functionality of the hardware, right? So you think about the electronic control units in vehicles, right? From passenger cars to John Deere tractors, and the basic functionality of those components, right? Of your fuel injector, of your transmission, all of that is controlled now through software, right? There's a computer. This is part of the reason, right? We're having so many shortages in the supply chain is we don't have the chips that we need to make cars run, right? Well, that to me is a pretty good argument for getting the chips out of the cars. Of course, there's like some functionality that you lose, and there are important benefits of some of this sort of integration. But the software really is being used to leverage control over the hardware. And so it's really tough to disentangle that relationship. You've got to have control or access to software in order to do really basic things when it comes to repair, right? So John Deere, for example, has this system in place where if you go out and buy like an authentic John Deere part and you install it exactly according to plan yourself on your John Deere tractor that you paid like $1 million for,
And which
you do everything right.
By the way, or like all have chips.
Oh, all over the place.
Yeah,
absolutely, right? So you install a part, and the part literally won't work until a technician from the local John Deere dealer comes out to your farm, attaches their laptop to your device, and basically authenticates or initializes this part. That kind of dynamic, I think, makes the separation here really tricky. Now, there are things like, pure kind of service dynamics, right? I don't think that we can say, connecting to your wireless provider is a repair issue necessarily. So we got to draw a line somewhere. But the design of these products makes it increasingly tough to draw that line.
Ben, you're muted.
So help me out. When you talk about the right to repair, are you talking about making illegal such manufacturer-imposed restrictions, or are you talking about a more normative conception that, hey, if you buy a piece of frickin' hardware, you should have a certain amount of right to tinker with it and fix it yourself? Like, what's the parameters of the right that you're hypothesizing, and what's the mechanism by which that right is operationalized?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because like the right to repair movement, which is I think largely responsible for the news that we saw with Apple today. There's been a group of people who've been working for years, putting pressure on all sorts of actors, putting pressure on device makers, putting pressure on legislatures, putting pressure on regulators and courts to try to move in this direction. And so the term, I think, is used in a lot of different ways that are all directed at the same goal, but are targeting different parts of the problem. So for the last few years, there's been a very targeted effort at passing what's called right to repair legislation in states across the country. I think last year there were 27 states where these bills got introduced. None of them got passed. One did make it through the New York Senate. I'm hopeful that this state legislative season, kicking off in 2022, will actually see one or more states pass this sort of law. So what those right to repair bills do, and I think this is kind of the narrowest conception of what we mean by the right to repair, is that they mandate that device makers make available to consumers and to independent repair providers replacement parts, diagnostic software, manuals, and other kinds of repair information that's necessary in order to make these sorts of repairs. So it would tell a company like Apple, for example, look, you refuse to sell anyone other than your authorized repair partners any component of an iPhone. You have to make those available on fair and reasonable terms to any consumer or any independent repair shop that wants them. You've got to provide them the kind of information that they need to execute that repair. And not surprisingly, those bills are looking pretty promising this time. And so Apple decides, well, we'll go ahead and do that ourselves. So that's one conception of the right to repair. But when I talk about it, I mean something considerably more broad than that relies on a bunch of different areas of law, right? That looks at the way intellectual property law is applied in this space, that looks at the scope and availability of design patents, that looks at exemptions under Section 1201 of the DMCA. It looks at consumer law and talks about, warranty protections and when companies are entitled and when they're not to void a warranty. That looks at antitrust law and thinks about issues around tying of parts and services, of refusals to deal, exclusive dealing. I think all of those bodies of law sort of enter into the broader conversation here. And ultimately, I think what the goal needs to be is recognizing, both for the sake of consumers, but also because of the sort of massive environmental externalities at stake here, that we have a collective and individual interest in making sure that consumers have the ability to keep their devices working after they purchase them. Tinkering, I think, is a related issue and one that I certainly have some sympathy for, but I don't know that all of the same arguments play out there with quite the same force as they do when all we're trying to say is, look, I bought this thing, something broke, I ought to be able to restore this functionality.
So this is like super interesting to me too, because there is a level here that you just kind of talked about that I want to talk about more, which is like the John Deere registered repairman, right? Like the Maytag registered repairman, versus like your garden variety general mechanics. And there's a question of like, I know that we are both working on kind of issues of interoperability and interested in them in like various ways, but there's a question here of interoperability, which is like something that drove my parents to never buy, no pun intended, to never buy like German cars or like kind of other types of like, because there was such a cost to repair because you had to go to a specific Volkswagen dealership or someone that was like a foreign car service repair shop.
That's not why my family never bought German cars.
Okay, well, yes. Fair. Jesus. Anyway, like,
I have a German car. So, you know, that's like just this Jew generation will buy German cars.
Yes. Okay. I just was like, could have also said, okay, whatever. I could have said like Peugeot, but like, anyways, whatever. But the idea was that basically that was like my parent. Well, the idea was that there was an everyman repair ability that was like kind of present in certain types of models of cars. And of course that's changed. Like it's not by brand necessarily anymore. And a lot more is probably gone because of chips in the way of kind of becoming like there are these gatekeepers on repair. And I'm kind of interested what you think like the role of the internet is in all of this, in the sense that it has brought repair to almost everyone. The ability to understand and repair your own devices and look it up on YouTube and figure out how to do it is something that like was completely elusive to a farmer in Iowa and their $100,000 John Deere tractor, 20 years ago, and is much more available now. And so I'm just really curious, kind of like what you think of it as like, how you think of this movement as kind of dovetailing with like a kind of a access to knowledge type of movement.
So I don't think that it's a coincidence that these restrictions on repair in terms of hardware design, in terms of software locks, developed at the same time that information about repair is increasingly accessible, right? There's been a kind of effort to democratize repair. So we've got, organizations like iFixit, right? iFixit makes repair guides available for just like a staggering array of devices. You can go on their website and they will show you step by step with photos exactly what you need to do. They will sell you the parts. They will sell you the tools that you need. And there's a whole bunch of people on YouTube that are doing similar sorts of work, right? They're providing these walkthroughs on, okay, you have this model of toilet. Here's how you stop your toilet from running. You've got this particular brand of refrigerator. Here's how you deal with a compressor that's gone bad. That information has made it easier for people to repair things themselves. That eats into the margins of device makers in a couple of ways. One, it means people aren't as quick to go out and replace something. And second, it means they don't get the additional revenue stream that comes from providing repair services, right? You go talk to any car dealer around the United States, they will tell you they make more money on servicing cars than they do on selling new cars. That's a huge piece of the economic puzzle for them. And so losing control over repair is a big threat to a lot of companies' bottom line. I mean, John Deere, they see the repair service piece of their business as, an opportunity for growth. They see this as a big revenue stream moving forward. And so, I definitely think that the rise in accessibility has led to some pushback here. Although I think the causality runs in both directions. Part of the reason this community has become so vocal and committed is because they feel, and I think quite rightly, like they're fighting against, incredibly powerful and well-resourced companies.
Well,
but why isn't the solution to that, from the company's point of view, just to increase the number of features with non-user serviceable parts? So, one thing I cannot fix myself, no matter how many videos I watch, is the computer that I'm working with right now, or the microphone that I'm speaking into, right? These are...
what are you saying? Because of nanotech?
Yes,
because it's too small, or it would require too many specific tools?
So first of all, because there are tools that I don't have and I'm unlikely to acquire. Some of the parts are actually too small to work with yourself. Particularly parts you can swap out a microprocessor and put in a different chip, but you can't service the chip, right? You can,
sure.
There's things you can learn to do. And by the way, this is true. I'm somebody who lives near my cabin in the woods, who's a mechanic, says this is increasingly true of cars too, that a lot of the parts are not user serviceable anymore. It seems to me if John Deere wants to prevent people from servicing their own thing, why isn't the answer to that ever more refined product that is just hard to do yourself, rather than to make it make it contractually or technically impossible to do yourself? They win if you don't do it yourself, no matter how they get there, right?
That's a great point.
Yeah. So I think you're right. And in reality, I think we're seeing both of those strategies play out simultaneously, right? Open up an iPhone and look at the components that are in there. Look at the way that they are designed. Devices get smaller and smaller every year, right? That's, one of the few, I think, compelling cases for well, I don't want to say it's compelling. It is the argument that is presented for buying a new phone half the time is it's 2 millimeters thinner than it was before. And so that process of miniaturization, I do think, has a big impact on repair. And the sort of granularity with which devices can be repaired, I think, is quite different than it was 50 years ago. So now you're much more likely to have to swap out sort of an entire module rather than replacing one specific part that has failed. But even in scenarios where you could swap out one specific part, companies make it really tough to do that. So they're pursuing both of those strategies simultaneously. Here's an example of this, right? So MacBooks have a chip that sort of controls the charging process for the battery, right? And these chips are manufactured for Apple by a company called Intersil. They cost about $15, right, to produce. Except they have a contract with Intersil that says they're not allowed to sell that chip to anyone other than Apple. Apple is the only buyer of that particular chip, and Apple doesn't sell it to anyone. They don't install it on anyone's computer. They use it in manufacturing. So if that chip goes bad, if you could get access to one, you could spend $15, pay somebody to install it. You're good to go. Instead, you have to get a new motherboard for your laptop, which costs $1,500. And in reality, no one's going to do that either. They're just going to buy a new one. And so even when there is that opportunity to actually swap out a part, companies are pursuing strategies that make that really difficult.
Yeah, I really love that point, which is that it's actually more costly to repair something than it is to just buy something entirely new. And I think that it gets to the point that it's it seems very difficult absent regulatory regime. And this is something there's not, you pointed out in your tweet of the Apple news today, nothing like, nothing like the imminent threat of regulation to like make a company change its policy voluntarily. But without the imminent threat of regulation, there's no way, as Ben pointed out, as you point out, that we could have visibility into what the companies are doing to basically limit this level of kind of right to repair. And there's like in 8 different ways their incentives are not aligned at the bottom line to ever serve it, to like ever address this, or kind of like, I mean, I think that in like a lot of my work, their incentives are aligned. And so that's actually one of the reasons I think the self-regulation might possibly have some type of like purchase, but like there are no aligned incentives here, like at all. And I think that that's actually, I think it's like a really important point. I'm really curious if you're a tinkerer, like you yourself. And if so, on like what level are you like? Do you do you fix things? Like what in like writing this book and like doing kind of this work, like what do you do?
So less than I have in the past, right? In part because of a lot of these problems that we're talking about, right? Yeah, I fixed iPhones in the past. I had a broken screen and I was like, I'm not going to pay somebody else to do this. I'll do it myself. Did it a few times. And now, years have gone on and it's just more difficult to do than it was in the past. I've, worked on my own cars over the years, right? Partly just out of like a sense that like, I'm interested in figuring things out. I'm interested in seeing how things work. But I've kind of witnessed firsthand the like increasing difficulty, especially kind of in the electronic space, of doing things on your own. I tell a story in the book about my laptop battery was dying as I was writing the book. And so I like did the math. Okay, first I was like, all right, how difficult is it going to be for me to replace the battery in my laptop? I've done that a million times in like the 90s and 2000s. Then so I went to iFixit and I looked up the instructions and I got to the part where it said I had to use a chemical solvent to dissolve the glue holding the battery to the aluminum case of my laptop. And I was like, I'm out. Can't do it. Not going that far, right? Like that's not for me.
Like Ben, he's not going to buy like nanotechnology tools to be able to fix the chip in his laptop. Like not going to be soldering like with like 14 karat gold or like and zinc. Like, yeah. So then I was like, all right, well, what's it going to cost me if Apple fixes this for me? And of course, like they'll fix it, they'll swap your battery out, but like the price difference between them replacing the battery and me just buying a new laptop was like $250 or something absurd, right? And so, I'm writing a book about the need to repair more devices, and like mid-paragraph, I replaced my laptop. It's tough to navigate this space. Like even if you care about it, even if you're informed about it, it is a real challenge. That is such a great example. I love that. Also having like having to swap the device out often is like, yeah, I just, there is a point, like I also like, I am kind of a tinkerer and I love fixing things, and we never throw things, like, I don't know, I just kind of grew up in a very frugal household and like we never threw things out, and like there was always like a workshop in the basement where things went to go get fixed and then never came back. Like literally,
and now
like
you fix cormorants.
Yeah, I know.
And,
like
sea turtles.
I also rescue animals, but seriously, like, come on, if you grew up, I grew up in the suburbs in like Western New York. We had basement, and there was like my dad's like kind of like tool room, and like my I will say that it was not gender specific. My grandmother was like a huge kind of like woodworker, and there was all of this stuff that I came up with, but this room was just for like dead toaster ovens and broken toys of like various kinds, electronic and not, and like all types of kind of little things. And I just kind of wonder if people have those rooms anymore. And the answer to that, at least in New York, where people do not have the room for those rooms, and that this is like, no, they just throw it out. Like that's actually like a really weird thing that like I never have gotten used to in New York. It's just like the throw out culture because you don't have the room to store something that's broken. And I just kind of, but I wonder if like overall the entire approach to even like having a room like that has like become like a very like not a thing we do anymore, because in the time in which I've grown up, that like kind of need has changed. Do you think that that's, I mean, well, you're in Ohio, you kind of like, maybe you get it. Like, I don't know. Do people do that anymore? What do you think?
So I think the economic calculus has changed in like incredibly important ways. The prices for consumer devices are just like plummeting, like compared to like when I was a kid growing up in the 80s. Everything is so much cheaper, right? The price that you can, you know, spend to go out and buy a brand new 60-inch, you know, flat screen TV changes the economics in a way that, from a purely kind of self-interested perspective, I understand why people make the choices that they do. Throw it out because one, there are very few people that are still offering repair services for a lot of these devices, right? If you look at the like, you know, Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers for the number of people who worked in television repair in 1960 or 1970 and compare it to today, it's an industry that has just disappeared. And so repair prices go up and repair availability goes down, and people just replace more and more things when, you know, often like if your TV doesn't work, you know, it's probably like a 39-cent part that has gone bad, right? It's not, you know, it's not some like massive expense, but there's nobody to do the work. The problem with that analysis is that it's not taking into account the externalities here, right? The fact that there is just like this crushing mountain of electronic waste that we produce every year,
and
in terms of phones.
Dragging out of the ground to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean,
rare earth minerals, man.
So recycling is becoming more and more important in this space because like we're literally running low on so many of these materials, right? Like there's only so much to pull out of the ground at a sort of cost-effective rate before recycling becomes a necessity, which is great. Like I'm glad to see recycling, you know, especially for a lot of these rare earth metals become more more common. But part of the solution has to be making less. We have to produce fewer of these devices. And that's just not in the economic interests of a lot of these companies. I mean, Apple, you know, is essentially, if you look at where their profits come from, they're in the business of selling iPhones, right? That is the vast majority of their revenue. And I'm glad to see they're diversifying and getting into different kinds of services that might shift their incentives a little bit or take some of the pressure off the hardware end of their business. But that's what they're here to do. And we have to acknowledge that for what it is. They're not going to sort of decide on their own to just, you know, have a worse quarter than they did last year and sell fewer phones. There's going to have to be some intervention, I think, if we want to shift their behavior.
I totally agree with this. And if you've followed any of the cultural reporting that has come out of certain types of trash heaps and garbage heaps and the scavenger communities that live on them and live off of them, I feel like that is deeply like the future of like basically us running out of rare earth minerals to take out of the ground and us like going into kind of this future of like kind of remining them out of our trash. Just to mention briefly, like Dell apparently has like launched some new recycling mission. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that that's like progressive or hopeful?
So I did see that announcement from Dell, and look, lots of companies are investing more in recycling, right? Apple's got their fancy robot, the Daisy, and I forget the name of the other one. And, you know, they are spending money to make this stuff happen. I think they do it for two reasons. One is it's good PR. you're gonna put out your your annual environmental report, and you want to be able to say you're doing something positive. On the other hand, I do think there are increasingly going to be economic incentives for companies to invest more in recycling. They simply aren't going to be able to produce the number of devices that they are now, relying on the sort of same old extractive techniques that they have before, right? I mean, not to be too grim about it, but like there are only so many kids you can kill in copper mines before you start to see the value of recycling from the devices that people have cast off. So I think it's good that companies are doing this. I'm not gonna say they should like stop wasting their time, but I don't think by itself that any new recycling initiative is going to like actually solve this problem on its own. We need devices that last longer. I mean, the auto industry is doing a really great job. The average car in the United States it's like 16 years old or something, like incredible. Cars are lasting longer than they have in decades. And that's because there's robust competition, right? There's a bunch of different car makers out there, and they know that consumers for a big purchase care about repairability, they care about durability, they care about resale value. If we had that same set of incentives in place when it came to laptops and smartphones, look, the people who design for these companies are incredibly good at what they do. And if the incentives were there, they could build something that lasts. We just need to set up a system that sort of guides them in that direction.
Yeah, totally. Tom McGuckin, the floor is yours.
This question relates to Kate too, because she's the legal expert.
Well, Aaron's a law professor too, so.
Oh, okay, both of you. All right. Well, years ago, there were antitrust laws that were sort of enforced. I don't know if they were ever enforced. And there was a thing called tie-in arrangements, okay, where you took something like an auto part and you were a monopoly in the auto market, and then you extended your monopoly into the repair business, okay? Now, I don't see anybody enforcing that at all anymore. But I really wanted to get back to the European thing on power cords, because that's what I asked my question on. I read somewhere that Europe is going to require Apple to use a C-port power cord. In other words, not their little flat tongue device, but the standard C-port. And I noticed that Ben even got into this on his Twitter account with a guy named Max Boot, okay, about promoting, just one standard for cords. I drown in cords. I have a million cords everywhere. I mean, it's an argument with my wife every day on where the hell is the charger. All right, it's this sort of thing. So Europe sort of took a step in that direction where they're saying, okay, we want everybody to standardize on one cord. What do you think of that? Now, Apple came back and said, oh, well, they're stifling innovation. That's the most standard argument I've heard for a million years. Okay, but I'm just wondering what you think of that European regulation.
Those are both great points. So on the antitrust point, I totally hear you. So there was a case decided in, the mid to late 1980s against Eastman Kodak that dealt with precisely this issue in the tying space, right? So there the claim was Kodak, this dealt with photocopiers. They didn't want independent service providers to be repairing their copy machines. And so they cut off access to replacement parts. And the only way to get the parts you needed was to pay for Kodak's repair services. And Kodak lost that case, right? And that's I think, a really important precedent in this space when it comes to this kind of tie-in arrangement. And to be honest with you, when I read Apple's announcement today, that's the first thing I thought of, right? Sure, they're reacting to the possibility of state-level legislation. The other thing they're reacting to is there's new management at the FTC. And I think there is an appetite for much more aggressive antitrust enforcement. The FTC put out this Nixing the Fix report after studying this issue for a couple of years. They care about this issue. They're paying attention to this issue. And, I think Apple probably wisely doesn't want to be involved in 2 antitrust cases at once. And so this is a way of sidestepping that. To the European point, so the mandating of USB-C is, I think, a small step towards a kind of design mandate that doesn't deal with repair specifically, but does deal with kind of the broader problems of electronic waste and the production of all of these, additional cords. Like, why do we need, why does Apple need to sell you a cord with every single device you have? If you already have USB-C, you're good. There are other more aggressive steps that have been taken in Europe around repair already. So as part of the Eco Design Directive, there are some mandates about the design of certain kinds of home appliances, white goods, washing machines for your home, that say things like the parts that are most likely to need to be replaced have to be removable and replaceable with everyday household tools, right? Your standard Phillips head or flathead screwdriver, as opposed to some like obscure
special hex, like screwdriver or something.
Exactly. Yeah, and you have to be able to replace those parts without doing any permanent damage to the machine. And so we've seen Europe take more aggressive steps. There's talk of a second round of that Eco Design Directive that would go so far. We haven't seen this in writing just yet, but might mandate something like user replaceable batteries for smartphones, right? If you remember back to the flip phone days, you had your Motorola Razr. And, like with your thumb, you can pop off the back of that thing, replace the battery. Europe might do that. And if it does, Apple's not going to design, a battery or an iPhone for the US that's different than the one it sells in Europe.
Yeah,
and so, we might kind of see that. Exactly. Right. So I'm hopeful that Europe is probably going to be ahead of the United States in kind of these direct interventions in the design process. I don't know how well that would go over here, but I think the Europeans are clearly more comfortable taking those sorts of steps.
Yeah. Ray, the floor is yours.
All right. So if manufacturers are required to provide repair parts through, right to repair rate, regulation, how do you define how small of a part they have to provide? So if auto manufacturers only provided a new engine every time that you had a bad spark plug, that would not be meaningful repair. So likewise, if Apple will offer you a $1,500 motherboard every time you have a problem with a 3-cent fuse, or
they could offer you an Electron.
Right. So that might be a little bit too far on the small. Yeah. So where do you draw that line, and how do you actually make meaningful regulations so people don't just, manufacturers don't just make sort of token efforts saying, sure, here, you can get a $1,500 part to fix your $2,000 laptop?
What a great question.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's not an easy answer, right? Exactly how we define components is going to depend, at least in part, on the design of the product, right? So you open up a lot of, consumer electronic devices, and, every chip is on the same board, right? And so if one goes bad, you got to replace 3 or 4 or 5 different, what we might think of functionally as separate components, but the way that they're built, they function as a single part. Right. So one way to address this question is to look at the ways that these devices are designed and assembled to determine what counts as a part. The other thing that you could do, and I will point out, like this is not defined in the statutes with probably as much specificity as we might like to see in practice. But the other thing you can look at is sort of existing behavior and practices within an industry, right? Is this a component that you sell to your own dealers or to your authorized repair partners as a standalone piece? And if so, you've got to make it available to everyone else. The right to repair laws that have been introduced in states, by the way, are modeled after a Massachusetts law that was passed, I think, in 2011, that was specific to the automotive industry. And did mandate these kinds of parts being made available. And then it became sort of through a private agreement between kind of trade associations, became the de facto law throughout the United States. And the auto industry's figured it out. They know what counts as a part, largely, I think, through these kinds of existing relationships. If you sell something to the dealer, you got to sell it to me too. And so that disciplines the gaming in some ways. But I totally agree with you that that's an issue that's going to have to be sorted out, I think, once these rules are, hopefully in place.
Dr. Doom, you have the last question. If you can combine them, because we're about to run out of time. I really liked your question about your service book, and the question of improvement counting as repair, and then the question about Stallman.
Okay. So I have a Surface Book 2. It has 8 gigabytes of memory. I desperately need 16. The thing is sealed. I can't put in this cheap memory. So that's one question about extending right of repair to right of substitution. Improvement. And the second one was software, when it was closed source, was essentially the same problem. You didn't have a right to repair. Stallman introduced the GPL, which basically gave a right of repair for software. And as these devices became essentially dongles to software, hardware as a dongle rather than hardware as a device, you seem to have the same issue of how do you get the equivalent of a GPL? How do you, once Apple no longer supports an iPhone 6 in many ways, how do I get a different service provider to run an iPhone?
Yeah, great questions.
Yeah, those are both great points. So, when you talk about wanting to upgrade the memory in a device, I think that the kinds of interventions that we've been discussing with respect to repair will kind of, by their very nature, make that sort of upgrade process a lot easier for consumers, right? If your Surface Pro is, designed in a way that makes it easier to open up, right? If it's not welded closed, instead it's actually like enclosed with screws, right? That makes it easier to open the thing up and make some changes to it. Whether you're replacing RAM that has gone bad or you're upgrading to something bigger, I think you can take advantage of those kinds of design changes, the kinds of parts availability that we're talking about here, even though I think you could say that goes beyond repair in kind of the narrow sense of the word. And I think, your analogy to the GPL is really thoughtful in the sense that part of what we are trying to achieve here is, like in a very literal sense, right, to open these devices up so that we can understand how they work, so that we can make changes that sort of suit consumers' needs. And in many cases, that's just going to be restoring functionality that was lost for one reason or another. In other cases, it might require something that goes beyond that, right? What do we do when a company decides it's no longer going to support a particular device? I've written elsewhere about the need and the desirability of a system that allows people some greater freedom to use the software and services of their choice. So I think it goes beyond repair, but it's absolutely kind of consistent with the kind of ethos of the repair movement.
We're going to leave it there. Aaron, I've been looking forward to this conversation since you agreed to come on. I'm not saying that. I'm a huge fan of your work, and we haven't gotten to talk enough because I haven't been in the property world for a while. In terms of scholarship, but I'm going back that way. I'm doing a huge piece on Airbnb. Let's talk more. And I'm just really excited to read this book. I started it, and I hate to say this, I really like to read it in deadwood tree. So I'm looking
but also
forward to getting
come on again soon, because when you agreed to come on, that's when Apple capitulated and made this announcement. So who knows what would happen if you did it again?
I know.
I mean,
very true.
Amazon would agree to let us repair their trucks.
when they're stranded in our driveways. Yeah. Let's do this every week, and we'll solve all the problems real quick.
Yeah,
I think that's what's going to happen. We will be.
Hey, thank you both so much. This was great.
Yeah.
Thanks to you. We will be back tomorrow. It's a special announcement, people. We will be playing Where's the Lie with none other than Shane Harris, and intelligence reporter for the Washington Post. He will spin out a yarn. We will try to figure out if it's true. And that'll be 22 hours and 59 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We can't have fun anymore, but we can have Phillips head screwdrivers and hexagonal screwdrivers and flathead screwdrivers. And also glue dissolvents. And, and when we get frustrated at all, we can have a hammer. So until we get the right to repair. It was great to see you, Aaron. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm going to drop your link one more time. There you go. To anyone who wants to buy his book. Talk to you soon.